G'day everyone, and welcome to this episode 5 of the Jimny restoration series. In the last episode we looked at changing the driveline fluids, but in this one we're going back to the steering and suspension, specifically looking at changing out the leading arm and trailing arm bushings, as well as the tie rod and drag link ends. Now changing these components should improve the handling of the vehicle on road, but they also might be contributing to the steering wobble that we've been experiencing as well. Luke is off travelling at the moment, so I'll be filming this one solo. Let's get into it. So we're going to start with those leading arms, one of which is here, also known as radius arms. Now you've got one of these on either side at the front, and their role is to connect the axle housing to the chassis back here. So you've got two bolts here, each with a bushing, and then one back here connecting to the chassis side. So I'm going to grab my rattle gun with a 17mm socket. There we go. Now you will notice there's also a spring washer on the nut side. Should be able to just push the bolt through. If it doesn't go easily, you can just give it a bit of a tap. These two are a bit tight. You want to try and get your ring spanner sort of behind the shock absorber for this one. Alright, now for this last bolt, we can't actually get it out because it's going to hit the shock absorber on the other side. Conveniently, the lower bolt takes a 17mm. I'm just going to whip that out quickly. There we go. Now just check before you do this, because according to the service manual, some Jimnys will have the hard lines for the vacuum locking hub mounted to the leading arms. That's not the case for us, so just make sure you check that before you remove them. Now that should be free to pop out. Now it's important to note that I'm just going to do these one at a time. The reason being that if I leave the other radius arm there, the diff housing is going to stay where it is. It's not going to roll. If you do remove both of these, you might find it more difficult to get them back on the car. So I'm going to do the full job on this one, mount it back up before I remove the next one. Over in the workshop now, here's that leading arm that we removed. Now the process for both leading arms and both trailing arms is going to be very similar. So I'm just going to run through this one in detail and then talk about the differences afterwards. Each of the arms is going to have 3 bushings, and once you press those out, they're going to look like this. Has the internal section the bolt goes through with a rubber around it and then a steel casing around the outside. Now it's important that when we press these out, we're just pushing on the steel casing and not on the center part, which is a raised lip. So you can't just use a flat plate to press it. The reason for that is if you do press on the center part, the rubber will shear, it'll push through and it'll look like that, and you'll be left with the steel casing still sitting inside the radius arm, which is not what you want. The internal bore of each of these holes in the radius arm the bushings push into is 52mm. So we need something that's just less than 52 to press these out, but still large enough that it'll contact on that steel casing. I've found that the sleeve size to use for that is a 50x40, so 50mm outside diameter, 40mm inside. Now on the other side, you're going to need a larger sleeve. This time it's going to need to support that radius arm all around, and it's also going to need to be large enough on the inside that it allows that bushing that we're pushing through to go inside it as we press it out through the radius arm. And the size I'm using on the bottom there is a 54x64mm sleeve. So I put my larger sleeve on the bottom, my smaller sleeve on the top, which is going to press that bushing through. Now this is one of those jobs where having the right tools makes it a lot easier. In particular, you want a hydraulic press for this. So I'm going to be using a 20-ton press, but you probably get away with a smaller one for this. I've also got a couple of different sleeve and press plate kits. I'll put a link to everything we're using down in the description below. So we'll take our larger sleeve on the bottom, bushing above it, then our smaller sleeve, and then we're just going to take a steel plate, which is larger than that, to put on top to press it through. So once that first starts to make contact, you just want to feel all around and just make sure it's lining up properly. And then I'll start to press the bushing through. So what you're hearing there is just that steel sleeve starting to press down through the radius arm. There we go, I can feel that's getting considerably easier now as most of the bushing is pressed out. And that's just dropped out. So I'll release the jack. There you go, you can see that sleeve fits inside the bore and that bushing's been removed. So we're going to repeat that same process for the bushings at the other end of the arm. And fortunately they are all the same size, so you can use the same sleeves and the same arrangement to press them out. This is where having the 20-ton press definitely makes things a bit easier. Doesn't take much effort. There's that second one done. So there we go, there's all three of those. They all came out pretty nicely. Now I can see that the rubber is really hard and there is some cracking starting in the rubber as well. So it's probably a good thing that these are being changed. Before we install our new bushings, we need to clean up the bores. Depending on how much rust and stuff you have in there, you might want to use something like a brass wire brush to help you out with this, but I'm probably just going to use some paper towel and a bit of brake and parts cleaner because they're not looking too bad. And even just after a quick wipe, that bore's looking a lot nicer inside now. Alrighty, so now that we've cleaned up those bores, we can start looking at installing the new bushings. Now for the left and right leading arms, you're going to need the same part numbers. For each arm, 2 of these ones, and 1 of these, which is for the chassis or body side. And we'll put all those part numbers in the description below. The process is going to be very similar to how we removed the old bushings. The only exception to that is going to be, I'm going to use a slightly larger sleeve to press the new bushing in. I still want it to be the right size to contact on the edge of the steel casing so I don't damage the new bushing. However, this time I don't want that sleeve to be able to press through the radius arm, because this time I want it to stop when it gets flush with the end of the housing. That way the new bushing will sit perfectly in the center, flush with the outside on either side. And we're going to use the same size sleeve underneath, and the slightly larger one I'm using to press with is a 48 by 58 mil. So we'll head over to the press. It's looking pretty good. And there we go. That's flush now. 2 down. You can use the same sleeves for this one. It's just a slightly deeper bore, so it's a longer bushing. It can take a bit of time to get this all lined up properly, but it's really important that we do, because if we start pressing it on an angle, it's going to damage the bore and possibly damage the bushing as well. So now that those bushings are all pressed in, there's just one more thing we need to check. In the factory service manual, Suzuki actually provide a specification for how far the bushing should stick out past the edge of the arm. So for the 2 that are on the axle side on the leading arm, it's 8.5 to 10.5 millimeters. So you can just take a ruler and just check that you're within spec there. And these ones are all good. And then for the one that's by itself at the other end, for the chassis or body, this one should be 6 to 9 millimeters on each side. But as long as we've pressed the bushing in to be flush with the arm, we should be all sweet. So before we put that arm back in, I'm just going to give all the bolts, nuts and washers a quick clean up. I like to use a bit of brake and parts cleaner, paper towel, and a little brass wire brush works really well for cleaning the threads. Now they're all cleaned up, we'll jump back underneath the car and install this arm. Now it's important to note that the direction of the bolts matters on these ones. So for the leading arms, all 3 bolts need to be facing towards the center of the car. This is one of those things where I could use an extra hand. There we go. Your spring washers and your nuts go on this side, obviously. Dodge the shock absorber on the back. Beautiful. This third one I'm probably going to need to manipulate a little bit with one hand while I push the bolt through with the other. It's a little bit fiddly. That's gone in pretty easily though. So I'm going to torque these bolts up now. It's important to note that if you're doing this job on a hoist, or if you had the car jacked up with the wheels off, you can put the bolts in loosely, but you need to lower the car back down onto the ground, wheels on, and have it in an unloaded condition before you actually torque the bolts up. The reason for that is that if you don't do it, you pre-stress these bushings and it'll cause them to fail more quickly than they would otherwise. So I'm just going to snug them down first with a 17mm socket. And then I'm going to torque these ones up, and we're looking for 65 foot-pounds, which is 90 Newton meters. Then all that's left to do is to put the lower shock absorber mounting bolt back in towards the center of the car as well. Now the shock absorber lower nut should get tightened up to the same So that's that one done. I'm going to repeat the exact same process for the other leading arm. I'm not going to film that one because it is identical. So onto the trailing arms now, and you'll see they're a very similar design to the leading arms on this car. I'll be honest, I've cheated a little bit here. I've come through beforehand and I've loosened all these bolts using a pipe on top of my breaker bar. The reason for that is that these are pretty tight and rusted and you can't actually get a rattle gun in there, so I just wanted to make it a bit easier for when I film it. One of the main differences is there's this 12mm bolt up here which holds a brake line on, so I'm just going to whip that off first. That's just mounted on top of the trailing arm there, and there's one of these on either side, so I can pop that out of the way. Normally much tighter than it's going to appear here. Similar to the front, it's just these three 17mm bolts that we have to remove. There we go, that's the first one out. I'm just going to give that a few taps with my copper hammer. There we go. Fortunately for these back ones, it is right next to the shock absorber, but you don't actually need to remove it to get the bolt out. There we go. Alright, so because the bores in these trailing arms are about 52mm, it's going to be the same process as pressing out the leading arm bushes. Alright, those bores were particularly rusty inside, so I've given them a really good wipe out. So now we're going to look at the difference between the trailing arms and the leading arms. Firstly, the one that goes by itself at the body or chassis side is actually the same part number, whether you're talking about front or rear. The axle side is different, so you need two of these for each trailing arm. It's a different part number to the leading arms. And you'll notice when you look at the bushing, that instead of being a solid bushing like the ones on the leading arms, it's got these slots cut out of it. We need to align the slots in each of the two bushings. So I'll pop them in there, grab like a long ruler or a piece of wood or something and line up those slots in each of them. Once it's looking pretty good, I'm going to give it a bit of a tap with a hammer just to get it started so it holds it there. And again, I'm going to stop when that steel casing of the bushing is flush with the edge of the arm. So on the end that's by itself, body side is 6 to 9mm. So we'll just check both sides. That's all good. Between 8.5 and 10.5mm. And they look pretty good, so we'll go install this back on the car. Alright, so I'm going to start on the axle side. And these two shorter bolts are going to point away from the diff, so towards the outside of the car. Just going to give it a bit of a tap to line up the holes. Alright, that's through. Beautiful. And the last one can go the other way, pointing towards the inside of the car. Alright, so what I'm going to do, I can't line up this hole, but I can actually allow this wheel to roll a little bit. If I remove these wheel chocks, I'm going to put them on the front wheel instead. And that's going to allow just this wheel, all the other wheels will stay stationary, but just this wheel will roll back a little bit, and that'll allow me to line up this hole. Now I do have the handbrake off, but I've got 2 out of the 4 wheels chocked. So now, you can see this wheel can actually move a little bit, and that movement's going to allow me to line up this hole. You can use the same technique on the front as well. It's another one of those scenarios where an extra hand would be really useful. So I just had to chock that because I didn't have a third hand. Really, you need one hand pushing the tyre to rotate it forward, one hand pushing this up, and one hand to put the bolt through. If you get really stuck as well, you can just put a jack underneath this to push it up. But I've found with this car, it doesn't take a massive amount of effort. Important not to forget about this little 12mm bolt up the top here. Put that brake line back on. Same as for the leading arms, these are going to be 65 foot-pounds, 90 newton meters. And wherever possible, you want to be putting the torque wrench on the nut rather than on the bolt head. For these ones, I should be all right. Some of the other ones, though, it's a bit difficult to get in there. Alright, so we're going to move on to the steering linkages up the front now. First thing I'm going to do is jack the car up, put it on jack stands, and then whip the 2 front wheels off. Before I do that, I've chocked both back wheels and I've got the car in park with the handbrake on, just so there's no chance of it falling off the jack stands. That's looking good, so I'll grab my rattle gun, 19mm socket, and we'll whip these wheel nuts off. So we're looking up underneath the front of the car now, and we've got our two steering linkages here. We've got the tie rod located behind the axle housing and the drag rod, also known as a drag link, up the front here. The drag rod connects the pitman arm just here to the steering arm over on the knuckle housing just behind the wheel. So as you turn your steering wheel, your pitman arm here is going to rotate, and that's going to apply a force to turn the wheel through the drag rod. Then behind that, you've got the tie rod connecting the passenger side wheel with the driver's side, so that when one wheel turns, the other does as well. When you go and get a wheel alignment done, they'll rotate these rods, which will extend them or retract them to align your wheels. So we're going to be looking at changing the ball joints located on each end of the drag rod and tie rod, so 4 in total. So I'm going to start off on the passenger side. There's that tie rod there running across to the driver's side. I'm going to take my 17mm socket and just loosen that nut. Now you might find you have what's called a castellated nut here with a split pin through it. So if you do, you've just got to tap that split pin out first. I'm going to grab my ball joint separator tool. Super useful tool. If you don't have one, I'd recommend getting one. Just goes in there like that, and then as you tighten up this bolt, it presses down on the head of the bolt as part of the ball joint and it splits it apart. So I've just grabbed my 19mm and I'm just going to tighten. Oh, there you go, it's fallen right apart. That's because we've had it off very recently for our swivel hub rebuild. I'm going to go and do the same thing on the other side so I can fully remove that tie rod. Okay, so with that released on both sides, I can pull the tie rod out. Now these have a rubber boot on them, which is pretty shot on these, and it's letting the grease out. I've just given that tie rod a bit of a wipe with some degreaser. It was pretty filthy. And then I've written left and right on there so I don't lose track of that. Now, the most important thing when we change our tie rod ends or drag link ends is to keep track of the total overall length that's between the two bolt centers. So we're going to measure that quickly now and write it down. In the factory service manual, Suzuki say it should be around 1,132mm for the tie rod, but yours might vary slightly depending on what was needed for the wheel alignment. So mine's a little bit less, but I'm going to write that number down. The second thing we're going to check is how many threads we have exposed at each end past the lock nut. Now it should be the same. So I've got about 7 on each end here, 7 exposed threads. You might have 8 on one end and 6 on the other. When we put it back, we're going to try and make them the same. So in that case, we would put 7 on each end to average it out. The overall length will be the same. So now that I've written that down, we're ready to start removing these ends and putting the new ones in. I'm going to start by just putting it back into the steering arm and tightening that nut up loosely. Doesn't need to be tight, it's just to hold it in place. So now that that's in there, it's going to hold it while I undo this lock nut on the end here. I'm starting off with the left-hand end of the tie rod, which is a right-hand thread. So I need to turn this jam nut clockwise to loosen it. You can use a 24mm open-ended spanner, but mine's particularly stuck on there. So I'm going to be using a crow's foot wrench, which is going to grip the nut a little bit better and stop me from rounding it. There we go, that was particularly tight, had to use the cheater bar for that one. Now I can remove that lock nut or loosen it off so that the tie rod end will come out. With the tie rod end still held in the steering arm, I should be able to turn the whole tie rod to thread it off of the end there. Now this has flats on it, they're about 20mm, which is a bit of an odd size, so I'm going to be using a shifting spanner for this. There we go. Now I'm going to be reusing these lock nuts. You can replace them, but I didn't buy any, probably should have. So I'm going to clean this up and put it back on. And I can just undo this and remove the old tie rod end. And that one can go in the bin. We're looking at the right hand end of the tie rod now, which is going to be a left hand thread, meaning I need to turn it this way to get it loose. That's what happens when things are really rusty. Ball joint's broken. Gonna have to go to plan B. So a bit of a setback there with the ball joint breaking. Unfortunately, that can happen if these lock nuts are particularly seized. There was a lot of corrosion on the threads, so I ended up having to put what was left of the tie rod end in the vise and use a rattle gun to get the nut off so I can reuse it. If you are going to do this job, I'd highly recommend buying these nuts. I would normally do that, but I didn't in this case. They're only about $1 each, and then you don't have to try and reuse the old ones. But now comes time for cleaning things up. So in order to avoid the same issues where everything was really tight, we're going to really thoroughly clean inside the pipe to make sure that the threads are nice for the new tie rod ends to go in. So you can use a toothbrush, or I've got a brass wire brush, which is a bit more effective. And we're going to just try and clean all the corrosion out of the threads. Mainly want to make sure that the thread of the nuts is pretty clean. These ones are a bit corroded. So I'm just going to grab my new tie rod ends now. That's one of them there. I'll put the part numbers for left and right up on screen. They look very similar, except one of them's a left thread and the other's a right thread. So I'll grab my part for my left first, and I'll just find the nut which is going to go on. One of them will have the correct thread and the other one won't. I'm going to wind the nut all the way down, basically to the end of the tie rod end. I'm going to grab some anti-seize. I've just got Permatex anti-seize lubricant here. I'm going to put a generous amount of this on the tie rod end because I want to make sure that it's free to move when we go into a wheel alignment later. And this is also going to help prevent corrosion forming inside later on. Along the thread. And a lot of this is going to come out when I wind it into the pipe, but I want to have plenty in there, which is going to be a right thread. So I'm screwing that in clockwise, and I'm just going to wind that in. And I can see that that anti-seize is starting to go down into the thread, which is good. So once I've got it about where it needs to be, I'm going to wind that nut down. Anti-seize is annoying stuff, it gets everywhere. So as we were saying earlier, we want to end up with the same number of threads exposed as we started with. So I'm just going to count those threads. In this case, I'm going to need to wind the tie rod out a little bit. A little bit too far. We don't have to get it perfect because we are going to take the car for a wheel alignment afterwards. All right, that's looking pretty good. We'll leave that lock nut just hand tight for now. We are going to need to torque that up later. Same again, I'm going to thread my nut on first. It's looking pretty good. Pop some anti-seize on there. Try not to get too much anti-seize on yourself. Easier said than done. And we'll grab that right hand end, thread that in, left hand thread. That's going in much more smoothly than the old one came out. Now we will need to turn one of the ends so that they're both facing the same way. Right now this one's down and this one's up. That's not going to work, so I just need to rotate that. Now I'm just going to do a quick sanity check and just check the centers. Should be about the same as what it was before. That's looking pretty good. We'll pop this back in the car, making sure I get it the right way around. It's going to go up through the hole, and then I've got my nut on top. The new tie rod ends, the genuine ones from Suzuki, come with a hole through the tie rod end, which is for a castellated nut and a split pin. It's definitely worth getting those. I'll be replacing these nuts with some castellated nuts once I can get some. Then I'm going to go and insert the other end, which is going to be exactly the same. So these ones here get tightened up to 32 foot-pounds or 43 Newton meters. Same on the other side. Now we need to tighten up the lock nuts. The torque spec for these is 47 foot-pounds or 65 Newton meters. Keep in mind though, this is going to need to be loosened when they do the wheel alignment straight afterwards. Then I'm going to go and do the same thing on the other side. So onto my drag rod, and I'm just going to chuck my left and right on there quickly. So this one I can see actually does have a castellated nut up here with a split pin through it. So I'm going to grab my pliers and bend that out and then pull the split pin out so I can loosen the nut. This is where a pair of locking pliers are good because you can grip onto it. And that's what goes through the castellated nut. Trusty 17mm ratcheting spanner, handy for situations like this. There's one of those castellated nuts that I was talking about. If anyone wants to know, they're an M12 by 1.25. And we're grabbing this tool again. Now if you haven't done these for a while, they can really go bang. Ooh, there you go. That's why it's good to use the tool, because it's a bit more controlled. You can see the grease boot's absolutely shot. Loosen off that nut. Oh, it's already popping out. Awesome. Once you've got the drag rod removed from the car, again, make sure you measure the effective length between the two studs and write it down. You can use the same method that we used before where you mount it into the steering arm to hold it and then undo the lock nut. In my case, I found the lock nuts were particularly tight, so I've actually had to go down the path of cutting off the end of the drag rod end and then allowing me to be able to put a rattle gun over the end onto the lock nut to get it off. But that's just because this car's been fairly poorly maintained. You probably shouldn't need to do that. Before we put the new ends in, we're going to give this a really good clean out. There were some signs of some anti-seize being in there, which is really good because it means the threads are probably in better condition than they were on the tie rod. Now you'll find that the part numbers for the drag rod and the tie rod are the same, as in the left-hand end of the tie rod is the same part number as the left-hand end of the drag rod, and vice versa. The left-hand end is a right thread and the right-hand end is a left thread, just in case it wasn't confusing enough already. Of course, I've already got anti-seize on my pants in less than a minute, so I'm just going to wind the nut all the way up, and then we can start to thread that down into the pipe. If you're really in trouble and you've stuffed up your tie rod or your drag rod, you can actually still buy these from Suzuki as of the time of making this video, and they're not super expensive as well. Make the two ends pretty well line up again, and you want to have about the same number of threads exposed on each end if you can. The reason for that, by the way, is so that it doesn't bottom out or get to the end of the thread on one end and still have heaps of thread on the other. When you're lengthening or shortening the rod to do a wheel alignment, you ideally want both ends to bottom out at the same time so you get the maximum amount of usable length. Perfect. So that's ready to go back in the car. Now that these are both snug, we want to torque them up, and it's the same torque spec as before, 31.5 foot-pounds. I can't get a torque wrench on this one, so I'm just going to do my best to approximate that. Now that's nice and tight, I'm going to poke my split pin through. That's why this is a much safer system than the nylock nuts, because even if that nut starts to come loose, it won't be able to wind off because the split pin will hold it there. And tighten the lock nut at each end. Time to get the wheels back on and get this thing back on the ground. And lastly, we'll just torque those wheel nuts up. Far out, guys. I'm buggered. Those tie rod and drag rod ends took heaps longer than I was expecting, mainly just because of how seized they were due to the corrosion. But it just goes to show the importance of having those few extra little parts on hand. I should have bought some lock nuts. They're only about $1 each, and that would have saved me heaps of time. And I should have bought some castellated nuts as well to save me going back and changing them out in the future. But we'll know for next time. If you are going to do this job yourself, particularly the drag rod and tie rod ends, make sure you book yourself in for a professional wheel alignment. I've got this one booked in for a couple of days' time. If there's anything you'd like to see in a future episode, please let us know in the comments below. Otherwise, we'll see you next time.